Well, to unpack how the elective conference has been going thus far, we're joined via Skype by political analyst Professor Dirk Kotze. A very good afternoon to you. Morning, since we've been speaking the whole morning. Thanks for joining us again. Let's continue to look at the Democratic Alliance Conference and what has been unfolding today. Now, let's talk about Mbali again. If she does not win, will this create a rift between the black members and the white members of the party?
Well, there is the potential, but I think from a DA point of view, that's the one thing they try to avoid at all costs, because that will create a major setback for the DA if that is going to be the case. I think if one looks at the positions of black persons within the DA, it is spread across a very wide spectrum within the DA. So I think one should be careful to look at Mbali and Thuli as almost the sole symbol of a black presence within the DA. We talked earlier on, there were references to Phumzile van Damme, for example. She's a very senior person, parliamentarian in the DA. Solly Malatsi, who's their spokesperson. All of them have their own sort of roles that they are playing within the DA. So I think from a DA point of view, they want to protect that as much as possible. To what John Steenhuisen has just now said, that they claim to be the party that is the most diverse or the most inclusive from all the major political parties. So yes, it will be a major setback for them if some or other split develops.
Expropriation of land without compensation remains a sensitive issue. The DA says they've come out against during the Congress saying no to this. Your take on this?
Yes, this is an ongoing position of the DA. They've been, since, I would say, when the ANC adopted this resolution in 2017, they've been critical of it and they distanced themselves from it. So it's not a new position. It is something which they continue with. They have different proposals, and I guess that what they are failing to do is really to put it very much within the public space, to talk about other ways of maybe achieving something similar with respect to land reform. I mean, one of their messages that don't come through very well is the fact that they do commit themselves to land reform, but not in terms of expropriation without land. And I think this is one of the key problems of the DA is that they have policies, but very often it's seen as more that they criticize the ANC's policies instead of presenting their own policies. I think that in general is a problem of opposition parties, is that because of the dominance of the ANC, the ANC actually dominates the policy debate. And it looks as all the parties, including the EFF to a large extent, that they in a sense respond to the DA, to the ANC, instead of presenting their own views when it comes to policies.
The party is also resolved in the Congress to end farm attacks and murders by means of declaring farm murders as hate crimes. Just how rife is this problem in our country, and does the DA have the capability to bring it to an end?
I don't think the DA has that capability. Obviously not while they are still the opposition party. In places like the Western Cape, they are in a more powerful position or position of authority where they can make a difference. And then at some local government level areas also, although local government does not have the power of policing, so they won't be able to do it in those cases. I think what the DA is doing and what they try to take forward as an approach now is to consolidate different civil society organizations, especially in the agricultural sector, in order to see to what extent they can build the top of an alliance of not non-governmental organizations in order to deal with this matter. But ultimately, it comes back to the national policing function, and therefore it is a very important matter. I think what the breakthrough that has happened, maybe because of the Senekal incident, is that the national government is paying more attention to it, and there's more pronouncements being made by the national government about it. So it is certainly something which unfortunately has become a political issue in terms of the sort of the right wing, in terms of the role of that AfriForum is playing it, in terms of the position of the DA and then that of the ANC and the EFF. And I think one of the ways to approach it, the preferred way to approach it, is to, in a sense, depoliticize it as in terms of party politics, and rather see if the more national approach can be followed. But it deals with crime in general, and if we look at the different motions that were debated this morning, quite a number of them deal with some or other aspect of crime, which we know is a national issue and it affects all of us, whether we live in rural areas or in urban areas or wherever, or whether it is gang violence or whether it is gender-based violence or farm violence. These type of matters have become really national issues that must be addressed by all the parties.
They also dealt with tax legislation and ensuring that the way government collects taxes is to the benefit of citizens. What are your thoughts about this conversation that I assume South Africans would like to see people in leadership talk about more?
Yes, the tax is obviously now a very important issue, given the hopefully the revival of SARS as a tax revenue institution. At the same time, tax is also a policy matter between the different political parties. Parties that are more with a liberal orientation will automatically argue for less tax and less government involvement, and those more on the left would talk about more tax and therefore more government involvement in all sorts of services. So, and if we follow, for example, the American debate at the moment, the presidential debate, a lot of it is about this, about the orientation in terms of what is the state's responsibility and what is the responsibility of, with respect to tax as the means of dealing with those delivery of services or governance matters. So that is certainly something which the DA is focused on, and they have a long history on dealing with tax issues and developing their own tax regime.
So let's speak about the contest. Voting closed yesterday already. They probably already have an indication as to who the new leader is. Does the old adage of "it's not over until it's over" apply in this case? Is there still some hope for the contenders to convince any of the voting parties?
No, the election has been closed. So in that sense, it's not possible anymore to influence the outcome. As I understand it, they closed it and sealed it, all the information yesterday, and they will open it later today at around about 2 o'clock. So since it closed 6 o'clock yesterday, there's no possibility for any form of influence in the outcome of the elections. I think what is uncertain, obviously, is what is going to be the real results. And I think for all of us, it's going to be very interesting to see that, because there's in three posts, there's going to be a contestation.
Yeah. Will the DA still be the official main opposition come next election? Your thoughts?
Well, at the moment, the difference between the DA and the EFF is around about 10%. So far, the EFF has increased its support incrementally with each election, whether it's national or provincial or local elections, around about 2-3% at the time. So to have an escalation of their support past the DAs to get the point of, let's say, for example, close to 30%, and for the DA to lose dramatically, is relatively unlikely. I think with the local government election, one aspect which is an unknown factor until the election is the voter turnout. And the voter turnout very often determines also part of the election results, not only, therefore, how many voted per party, but also which party voted more than other party supporters. The DA normally has the ability to mobilize their supporters better than the other political parties in proportional terms. So I think the DA is more concerned at this stage about what is the possibility for them to lose votes to parties like the Good Party of Patricia de Lille in the Western Cape, and Action SA of Herman Mashaba, especially in Gauteng. I don't think the EFF will play a significant role again in the election as last year. And also the ANC and the DA are not so much in direct competition with each other. So the situation is a bit fluid, and it's quite difficult to predict it. But for the moment, especially if we look at next year's election, it's not going to deal with whether which party is going to be the official opposition in parliament, because it's local government elections. The EFF is generally also not so effective in local government elections, but more effective in national and provincial elections. So these are all factors, I think, that will play a role ultimately.
Yeah. I know we're just indulging ourselves with this one, but please allow me. When you've been watching the Congress unfold in the past 2 days, and when you look at the Democratic Alliance human capital and look at the contenders for leadership, are these the best people who could have raised their hands, or is there a leadership deficit within the DA, or is there a leadership strength and people who could have also been considered?
I think the DA is going through a transition period when it comes to leadership. They have lost a lot of their senior members who have retired over time. They've brought in the interim younger persons like Musi Maimane, like Landiwe Masibuku, like Pumzile van Damme and others. And then there's this sort of middle generation of John Steenhuisen and similar Natasha Mazzoni and others. But I think what you need is a combination of seniority and a middle group, and then a very active youth group. And I think at this stage they are not yet there. They don't have that combination which can bring in from different areas, create a team of leadership that includes all these different elements. There was a time during when Helen Zille moved out that she actually handed over a lot of the responsibilities to the young generation. And I think there's differences of opinion of how successful that has been. Now there is again with Mbali and Tuli an effort in order to bring in more of a youthful component into the leadership. I think what is important for all political parties is that they must invest more in the upcoming generations. Yep. Some parties, and the DA is to some extent was also involved in that, is to have so-called leadership academies or leadership training programs. And that's absolutely important in order to cultivate their own new leadership in the making.
An old party leader, Douglas Gibson, in trying to sway the conference, commented just ahead of the Congress that Mbali Ntuli was too young and lacked experience. Do you think his efforts will pay any dividend?
Not on its own. I think he is one voice. But at that stage, I think most of the delegates have made up their minds about who they are going to vote for and what are the considerations that they will take into account. He was quite severely criticized by Pumzile van Damme about what he has said in this respect. So I think one has to be careful not to be at the last moment, especially the more senior persons, to try to sway the vote in whatever direction. But that normally doesn't work. As I said, most delegates would have made up their minds well before that point.
Yeah. As we end our conversation, Prof, I'd just like to digress a bit. You were talking about the importance of what business calls the pipeline preparation, where you prepare leaders ahead of time. And I'm looking now, Mkhuleko Hlengwa has just tweeted about how he and Mbali are friends, but they're usually very respectful of their different political party positions. What are your thoughts about political leadership prospects for South Africa going into the future in terms of all the parties that play a prominent role in South African politics?
I think at this stage, most of the parties are not in a good position. Most of the parties, the DA, for example, or the ANC, to some extent still the DA. Some parties like the Freedom Front Plus, all of them don't have necessarily that generational spread that I think is important to have. One of the features of South African politics, for example, the last number of years, is that the voice of the youth organizations of the different political parties are almost quiet. When last have you heard from the ANC Youth League or the DA's student organization or the Freedom Front's youth organization or the ACDP or the UDM? Very seldom. And I think that's a vacuum, that's a gap that exists in South African politics. The youth becomes too quickly absorbed in the senior politics, and I think that's a weakness in South African politics in general, is that there's not a identifiable sort of youth component, youth politics in general. Student politics is there to some extent, but it's too much dominated also by specific issues on campuses or specific matters with respect to SRC politics. But it's not necessarily focused on the national issues or the public issues in general. So I think there's a lot of attention that has to be paid to that.
Yeah. So South African discourse currently is dominated by corruption and state capture. Just looking at what you've been saying about the political landscape and the capabilities that lie there, at what point can South Africans be assured that we will start to deal with the real issues of poverty and development of the country and growing the economy?
I think that's obviously one of the key questions that all of us are struggling with, and there's not a very easy answer for this. I think what we are seeing is the contribution that's being made by government. We have just seen the latest medium-term budget speech that was presented by Minister Tito Mboweni. Earlier on was this recovery plan, reconstruction and recovery plan presented by President Ramaphosa. So that is the government's component of it. But I think most people will say that the government on its own cannot do it. They don't have the resources, they don't have the capacity, they are not orientated towards doing business and being directly involved in the economy. They must create rather the infrastructure, the framework, the environment within these processes can take place. On the other hand, the private sector is supposed to be the other very important partner. In some areas, they do play that role. For example, now with the infrastructural funds and infrastructural projects that's in the pipeline. But in other areas, I think the private sector still has to do more. One of the results of what has happened over the years is that I would say the government or the state has become too much of an economic player in South Africa, and that the private sector has become too dependent on what happens in the public sector. Take, for example, the construction sector, the construction companies that have been in trouble because the finances of the government couldn't provide for major infrastructural developments. So they've become, in my view, too dependent on contracts from government. In many other areas, there's many businesses in South Africa that's completely dependent on contracts with government. And that's not a healthy indication of where the economy stands. So that will have to change. It's almost structural changes that must take place in order to develop an economy which can stand on its own feet and which is not so dependent on government. And that is something which all of us, the civil society, the private sector, government, all of them will have to come together to put together our thoughts, our ideas of how to make these changes. I think, for example, the digital economy is going to have huge opportunities, create huge opportunities for us, for young up-and-coming persons who have been at the university or even have technical training, to take their own initiative and don't have to wait for job creation by government in order to be able to create a life for themselves. So these are, I think, the type of thoughts that we have to explore more and more in future.
Professor, while you and I and most South Africans, I imagine, await that announcement this afternoon, thank you. Let's thank you very much for creating time to speak to us today.
Thanks very much.